want to welcome you to this, I guess, the last Dean's meeting of this calendar year. And as you know, the Dean's lectures are really designed to recognize people who in our system have been promoted or appointed to professor in the School of Medicine. And this is a huge honor. And you know, as I've said before, the decision is not made by me or even really by the AMP or the advisory board. It's made by colleagues around the world. The process is that we send out a request for other faculty to evaluate candidates, and it's based on those letters and their accomplishments that we make the decision. And as a, you know, I think that it's hard to get on the faculty here at Hopkins. It's not easy, but it's even harder, of course, to be promoted to professor. And so it's a huge accomplishment to do so. And I'm cynical about lots of things, but I'm not cynical about this. So this is really a day of celebration for Adnan. And probably everybody in this room knows Adnan, but I'm just going to introduce him a little bit. He's professor now in the Department of International Health and Deputy Director of Health Systems. And he also directs the International Injury Unit, which is a WHO collaborating center for injuries, violence, and accident prevention. And he directs Road Safety in 10 Countries project for the Bloomberg Philanthropies. Now, well, I think Adnan was one of the first faculty members that I met when I came to the school. And I met him because of his interest in injuries. And then I remember having a meeting about health systems. And we sat down, and said, I know you from somewhere. Weren't you the guy who was here for injuries, but now health systems? And then I met with the Berman Institute of Bioethics, and he was there as well. And he is really a Renaissance man. He has incredible interest and accomplishments in very broad areas. And that was confirmed by your letters, who recognize your incredible ability to do research across a variety of fields and to mentor people, not only from the U.S., but from various countries. The other thing about Adnan, for those of you who have been to graduation, you know that he has the best-looking academic regalia of anybody in the school, because he graduated from Aga Khan University, and he has this brilliant green silk. Is that silk? It's silk, right? It's silk. Yeah, silk regalia. So I won't spend much more time other than to say that. You know, he has these broad accomplishments in injury epidemiology and prevention, road safety, in health systems, and in ethics. But he's going to talk about something else today, and that's research capacity strengthening. So Adnan, we're all here to celebrate and to look forward to your words. So,
thank you very much, Dean Clegg. Great pleasure and honor to be here, and thank you to all of you for joining me today. When I was thinking about what is the topic that I should really talk about today, it struck me that another talk on injury or another talk on ethics might be predictable. So let's do something which is really talking about one of my passions. And that passion is across all of these fields that I work in, and that's research capacity strengthening, particularly focused around low and middle income countries. I don't have anything against high income countries, by the way. It's just that my passion lies in the developing world. But before I begin, I suppose it's important to do a 30-second reflection on myself and then externalize that to a few thank yous around. So first, a picture for those of you who didn't know me when I was a medical student. That's how I entered medical school. Then a few years later, 20 years ago to be exact, I arrived in this country and entered as a Master's of Public Health student. And now you see me 20 years later. So I leave the rest to you, if particularly those of you who are students, if you want to go from that black hair to the white hair, certainly enjoy. But these 20 years have been remarkable. I think particularly because of the support that I've had in my career. Particularly want to thank my family. My wife, Momina, my daughter, Mariam, is here. My other one, Myra, is in college in New York. Want to thank them for their dedication. As many of you know, as we travel and go around the world, somebody else is looking after so many other issues. By the way, I picked out this particular photograph because this is the one my daughter said, don't show that one. It's really embarrassing. You're wearing your Indonesian batik shirt. So And so, Murray, I'm sorry, I picked this one. But incredibly so, it's been a great privilege working with so many different colleagues. From the day I entered the school, Richard Morrow agreed to be my advisor. Bob Black was still the chair when I entered the school. I went to Tim Baker, and he said, young man, don't do injuries. There's no money in it. Go look for a career in some other field. To the wonderful advice and support over the years of so many people around the school. I can't name all of you, but certainly want to recognize colleagues in international health, in bioethics, and in so many other respective departments and units of this school who've been privileged in one way or the other. I've had the privilege of working with them. But more importantly, I think, in many ways, I particularly today want to thank staff. And that's because I don't think any day of mine would have been possible without the help and support of staff members. And that's just not within the division or the department that I work in, but also across the school. And I specifically want to mention my colleagues in the IRB, in the communications and development offices, because frankly, it's been a great, great energy and support that they have given to me personally and to my causes. And it's because of them that many, many of our projects and research work were possible. And finally, little do they know how much my students of all types, shapes, and sizes mean to me. And if you actually found out how much I learned from you, you would ask me to pay you tuition, if that could be possible. So just a few minutes to thank all of you, those who are here and those who aren't in spirit, for the many, many years of wonderful support and collegiality, and I hope many, many years to come. So today what I'd like to do is to talk about one of my passions, but in a little bit more systematic way, and really use this opportunity to do two things. One, I want to bring together in a much more systematic way ideas and thoughts that I've had over the years about capacity development in developing countries. But secondly, to also start a process of brainstorming with you all about this particular issue and see if this particular process, as opposed to a content area, can become the focus of academic study and scholarly work. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about why we do this, how do we do it, and how can we measure it. And fundamentally, we're going to start that conversation now. Before we begin that conversation, important to point out that every title slide will talk to you about road safety in one form or the other, and you know my passion around that particular issue. But let me begin by making sure that we are all talking the same language. And in order to do that, I want to spend the first 5 or 6 minutes just to make sure that we have the same conceptual frameworks when we think about research. So I want to talk about some of the work that I did over a decade ago with the World Health Organization in particular on health research systems. And here our idea was, over a decade ago, to begin to think about national health research systems. And I'm going to make this extremely abridged, but in short form to say, we recognize that there are health systems that exist in countries. That in fact, there are also research systems that exist. They are in agriculture, in education, in law, in sciences. And in fact, these systems exist not in a vacuum, but rather within the context of the private sector, the industry, the civil sector, and within national contexts that are extremely important, as well as international influences. And so the conceptualization of a research system began with understanding this context and the positioning of a health research system right in the center of this. This conceptualization was important because we wanted to define a national health research system as those institutions and people and activities whose primary purpose is the production of knowledge. And not just the production of knowledge, but its utilization. And utilization to improve health of the population. Now, this conceptualization is important for our further conversation in a few minutes, because if you begin to think about this broad conceptual framework of a national health research system, you can begin to think of certain functions. And we conceptualized 4 large functions of a health research system, not only the production and utilization of research, but also the resources that go towards that production, the financing that will enable this production, and very importantly, its stewardship, decision-making, priority setting, the morals around this. And these 4 functions in a national health research system would come together to serve the purpose of a common set of goals. And of course, these goals included advancement of knowledge because you're producing knowledge, but also ultimately in its utilization to promote health and, very importantly, health equity. And indeed, some of you can predict that those of us who were on this committee, many of us were interested in notions around health equity, and I'll come back to that particular issue in a few minutes. So this broad conceptualization was important. It allowed us to begin a conversation over a decade ago around national health research systems, and yet, while these broad concepts were good, we didn't know what's inside these health research systems. What are the components? And so, together with a number of colleagues, we began to think about components of a research system, and now I'll present to you the framework that I have used over the past 7-8 years in my work, and which I will use for the rest of this talk. Because clearly, one very important component are all of us, researchers, investigators. But we don't work in a vacuum. We work within a confluence of influences that could be called, on the one hand, institutions, because we work in them, national policies and contexts, because we work with them, and very importantly, processes, stewardship around the research process, whether it's research approval, research review, etc. And of course, these function within a set which is important in terms of the national context, or what I call enabling conditions. How strong is civil society? Is there trust in basic processes in the country, etc.? A bunch of other issues that enable these institutions and investigators to work. And yes, you can build up to a different level as well, and then talk about ideas of development. Because every country is at a different stage of development. And the ways of recognizing this development, there are many ways of doing this. For example, you can use Amartya Sen's concepts of the freedoms, the political freedom, the economic freedom, or the will. You can also use notions of income and low and middle income context, etc. Many different ways. But here is then the components of the research system that I'd like to work with. And of course, this is not the only way you can describe components of a national health research system, but the ones that I'd like to use for the rest of our talk today. Why is it important to define these? Because I wanted to move the conversation of research capacity development beyond individuals. Wanted to move to a level where people begin to recognize that institutions have a lot to contribute, and very importantly, begin to recognize these relationships between these components. So it's not investigators alone or institutions alone who can function, but rather this nexus, these relationships that become critical for our work. So let's pretend then, for a moment at least, that we are in agreement that some form of national health research systems exist in countries, different types, different shapes, that indeed those that exist in low and middle income countries need support and strengthening. And the real question that I want to address for the rest of my talk today is, why should we engage in this process? How do we do it? And how do we measure our success? So this initial section was to make sure that our terminology, our language, and our conceptual framework is clearly understood. So let's begin a conversation then around the morals, right? Why should we do it? And what I'd like to do is talk about the moral justifications at 3 or 4 different levels. One that I will call the internal level, the relational level, the contextual level, and then a little bit more. I preface this by saying I'm neither an ethicist nor a philosopher, but I have many colleagues in the audience who can then correct me as I present this analysis. This first level, which I call personal, I'm actually going to personalize to myself. And I'm going to do this because I represent a set of individuals who come from the developing world and make our homes here, who immigrate. And for us, one of the important motivations is this sense that we had received valuable kindness when we were there, education, skills, and it's time to give back. Principle of reciprocity in some ways, building on the philosophical traditions of gratitude, an important reason why we engage in research capacity strengthening. On the other hand, it's difficult to deny the fact that we left. So we are part of what has been called the brain drain. I have issues around this terminology, but I'll come back to that later. And we assume this sense of guilt. And so another motivation that drives some of us is this notion of getting rid of this guilt, this notion of atonement. How do I pay back? And then very importantly, there is something else. While we want to do this, we don't want to lose our connections. We have moved away, and yet we want to retain our communal identity as some portion of the developing world. And this notion of communal identity, this notion of solidarity with people who are still there, is a third motivation acting at the personal level that is important for our work in capacity development. This set of reasons operate, as I say, at the individual level, important for persons. But also, we have to think about those we are, quote unquote, and I will use that expression just for a moment, helping others. Let's talk about the individuals. And here, the justifications can be divided up, I think, into two different flavors. One, when you're actually aware of who you are helping. That is, when it's a known quantity. And that knowledge doesn't have to be specifically pertinent to the individual, but known as in belongs to the same city, belongs to the same university, belongs to the same alma mater. Notions of kinship. They take on certain forms of obligation, and that's why research capacity strengthening becomes important for us. And yet, even when you are working with the unknown, it is important. And you have ideas of this common human experience, this notion that there ought to be some development that occurs. And so you respond to notions of altruism, maybe, responding to the traditions of kindness that have existed in humanity for centuries. So this level operates at the level of recognizing the object of that support. But I think there's a third level, which is common to many, many of us. And this is where all of you interested in ideas around social justice will recognize. The first thing is we recognize disadvantage. And we recognize that there is vulnerability. And there is a response to that vulnerability. Alan Williams has called it the fair innings argument for those who understand cricket. They didn't have their fair innings. And so they ought to do so. And therefore, capacity strengthening becomes important. A second and allied reason is not just recognizing the vulnerability, but actually feeling angry at inequalities. Indignation. This notion that surely this is not how things ought to be. Very recently, Jim Lavery has actually tried to use this and formulate a new principle called relief of oppression, slightly controversial, but building on these similar feelings, this Rawlsian perspective of responding to previous injustices. That's an important moral reason for engaging in research capacity strengthening. And then there is this notion that everyone ought to develop and have the opportunity to develop their skills. And therefore, these basic notions of respect for persons become very important. And so this set of reasons that I'm enunciating right now operate at the societal level and are important justifications for our work. But not only this. There are many of us who say, this is the right thing to do. I don't need any of the previous reasons, because what I'm going to engage in will produce things that are morally acceptable, morally good, research production, improvements, and health. A very deontological approach, a justification that says, this is right, and therefore I or we shall do this. A very different spin, but important, because it allows us to justify our investments in research capacity strengthening. As I talk about these issues, it's fair to say that you begin from an area of moral justification, and very quickly there's a slippery slope because you begin to think of benefits to yourself as well. When I say yourself, it could be to the individual or to the institution. So for example, you begin to think about strategic interests as well. It's good for us, it's good for our institutions, good for our reputation. And it's a slippery slope. Recently, in fact, there's a paper out from Shams Syed, one of our graduates, who now works with WHO, who's talking about the benefit that developed countries get from these partnerships between developing and developed countries. And they've identified 10 areas in which you can actually quantify those benefits. So it's not necessarily just altruism. There's a lot more to this story, obviously. But what I'm trying to propose here is that understanding these personal, relational, and contextual justifications are very important for our work. It's time that we think about them, that we explore them, and very importantly, that as a community we write about them. because this is true not only for us as individuals, but also true of us as an institution. And indeed, we are going to be 100 years old soon as an institution involved in this fundamental enterprise of research capacity strengthening. So those, I hope, are a spectrum of reason, a set of reasons which I think form a very concrete foundation for us to engage in this activity. The question now is, how do we do it? And what are the metrics by which we will measure this? Let's go back to our conceptual framework, and I'm now going to talk about research capacity strengthening on RCS at 3 different levels. For now, let's start with the level which many of us are familiar with, the level of the individual. So this is what traditional models of capacity development have been about. Individuals are selected, individuals are trained, they go and they produce great research. Traditionally, these models have that people from the developing world came to the west or the north, got trained, returned home, and were successful. And there are many, many, many such examples over the past 30 years of such investments and programs. I will also talk about a couple of the pieces of work that I'm involved in. One, the Fogarty grant-supported work that we do in injury prevention, as well as that which we do in research ethics. Now, the strengths of this model is that it's tried and tested. And actually, it pays off enough of the time, so that the majority of the time, you do well with it. You produce leaders. You actually can create change. And once in a while, you produce a champion. And that really fundamentally shakes things around the world. But at the same time, it's highly dependent on single individuals. It assumes that people will return. Ignore my past for a second. It assumes that the trainee will be utilized when they do return. It also assumes that the trainee will be successful in the same context from within which he or she had left. And that's big assumptions, big assumptions. And very often, of course, when you train one individual, you can train them only in one specific area or topic, and there's a lot to cover. And so, another challenge that we come across, in which many of us have to write for our grant purposes, well, then how do we measure this change? How can we make sure that this is wise investment? And I'd like to share with you one approach that we've tried in the past 5 or 6 years. And one of the approaches that I've worked with colleagues here is to say, look, research capacity strengthening is a process. And if it's a process, then certainly there are inputs and outputs and processes and outcomes. It's just like doing any systems analysis. And so we used, for our one side of our framework, a very simplistic systems approach. And then I learned from the injury world about the Haddon matrix and the fact that there is pre-event, event, and post-event factors, and used that to produce the second axis and say, look, what's happening before the training, during the training, or after the training, to develop this 12-cell framework. And this 12-cell framework we have tried to apply in some of the projects that we are doing. I share with you the example of the work that I do with colleagues at the Bioethics Institute in the Fogarty Ethics Program, which has been wonderful and operating over the past several years. And in looking at our first 9 years of operation, for example, we trained 28 people, and they produced lots of papers and lots of grants and so on. But we also captured other things, like how many times were they invited to attend a workshop, or how many times had they taught a course. We also looked at participation rates, not just the fact that you have numbers or outputs produced, but how many of them actually participate in these events. So that more than half, for example, in this analysis, were able to participate. In other words, this 12-cell framework allowed us to go beyond focusing on the traditional parameters of did they produce papers and did they write grants, which, of course, the traditional metrics for evaluating individual level capacity strengthening. We found this generally rewarding. This work is still ongoing, and I hope that if other colleagues find this useful, we can have a dialogue around this particular framework. So that was the one that I went through a little bit quickly, because that's the individual level. I feel that more and more people are used to this. Let's talk about institutions. One institution being represented, of course, in this photograph. And I want to move to the institutional level because that really is where I want to talk and where my current interest lies very heavily. How do you do research capacity strengthening at the level of the institution? And in fact, this circle is, as you all can figure out, is a schematic because it really ought to be bigger because institutions have much wider influences, particularly those who are leaders in their region. And this is where we can go back and talk about the previous 15 years of work around institutional capacities. And I went back to the work of people like Lynn Ellsworth that talked about what is institutional capital. And they defined 4 large parameters: the tangible capitals, human or intellectual capital, organizational capital, and social capital. So when you think about research capacity strengthening, you've got to figure out which part of these capitals are you going to invest in and how. This doesn't mean you don't do individual capacity strengthening. Of course you do it as part, because you've got to be involved in developing human resources. But it does allow you to work beyond topics, across sectors, across different fields. And very importantly, it allows you to work not just on content areas, but on those very important enabling processes that allow institutions to function, such as financial management, such as ethical review of research, etc. And in fact, institutional capacity strengthening can allow you to help develop new structures and new policies in existing institutions, and the part that I, for example, enjoy a lot, which is to develop strategic plans with institutions and help them think through the next 5 years or 10 years of work. And that involves a lot of effort, a lot of ownership and buy-in. And fundamentally, what institutional level research capacity strengthening can do is really begin to shape institutional identities. And then we hear phrases like, we want to become a research-intensive university. We want to be known not just for training, but also for research. And that's rewarding, and that's important. And yet, it's really difficult to measure this. And so we've been experimenting a little bit with many of my colleagues, some of whom are in the audience. I'll share with you 2 different approaches. One, from my injury work. We looked very hard at our individual level framework and we said, is this applicable? And that wasn't directly applicable, and yet we decided that what is applicable is the fact that we've got to think about the institutional capital that we are working on. We need to define this. And here are your 4 types of institutional capitals. And we loved the framework as well of time frame. And so we began to think about before collaboration, during the collaboration, and after the collaboration. And this again allowed us 12 different cells to figure out what are the metrics in each of these cells that we can think about in terms of institutional capacity strengthening. And so in applying this, for example, to our relationship with Aga Khan University, my alma mater, in the field of injury prevention, we have just started populating this framework and began to look at interesting metrics that we could use. And so without thinking about this, we may not have come to recognize that, yes, we did play a role. I don't know what percentage role, but we did play a role in moving a small section of emergency medicine into the first academic department of emergency medicine in all of South Asia. That we did move them from being hardly one single person doing injury research into a WHO accredited center on injury and trauma research. Again, whether we were 5% part of the story or 95%, I don't know, I can't claim, but we were part of the story. And this allows us then to think about these different levels. We're finding this interesting, colleagues are working with it, and useful. This is one approach to measuring research capacity strengthening. But in our ethics work, we've taken a very different approach. In our ethics work, we wanted to have a system of measurement that is more deliberative, that is more engaging. And so we looked for frameworks, and eventually I found one that has been used for assessing non-governmental organizations in Africa by bilateral donors like Sida Sarek. And this one is called the Octagon Framework. I don't know if some of you have used that, but as the name suggests, it has 4 large categories of institutional effect. The basic identities and structures in organization, the outputs and activities of the organization and its relevance, the capacities, whether they are the correct capacities and systems of financing and administration, and very importantly, the relations and the context within which this operates. Important elements for any organization to move forward. And in looking at this, we decided to make sure that we have an empirical basis for assessment. And so in our work, we've been collecting lots of data using different methods. All of you are familiar with those methods. And then analyzing that according to the Octagon Framework and even scoring them. Scoring them not because they are objective indicators like mortality rates, but rather scoring them because that's where we think institutions are at that phase. So let me tell you the advantage of this is that you can have nice visual displays for discussions with your collaborators. And that allows you a form of communication and discussion that sometimes is missing when you just do dialogue. And so I share with you some draft work from the University of Botswana. We worked with them for a year. We scored them in a certain way, and this was our result. But we didn't stop there. We informed them of the methodology, and we said, why don't you rate yourselves? And they rated themselves as well. And this allows for a discourse, isn't it? Because when you put both of them side by side, you begin to think, wait a minute, they're not exactly the same. Why are these differences? And that opens room for discussion. And you also point out to them, well, why did you rate yourself less in some areas and more on others? What are the gaps that can be addressed through different mechanisms? And so we feel that this is a second approach to measuring institutional level research capacity strengthening, which indeed may be useful, particularly if the fundamental notion is to keep institutions moving along in an engaging way, in a way which is fundamentally important for partnerships. So the strength of institutional level RCS is, of course, that it strengthens institutions, it allows sustainability, it allows local and regional impact, it even allows establishing centers of excellence, as we found. But, of course, you do need institutions with some basic support systems. You just can't pick up any institution. You assume that there is commitment of leadership and hopefully some consistency of leadership and less change over time. And yes, at points it can require more resources, and certainly it will require more time than a one-year master's degree, because that's not going to happen with an institution. And while our work with institutions is rewarding, and we are engaged in it, and we hope to continue work with it, I think what is really exciting to some of us, including myself, is this notion, let's go beyond single institutions. Do we really have to limit ourselves to doing research capacity strengthening one university, one research center, one organization at a time? What about if we can be brave enough to address this whole system in some way or the other, or parts of it that are larger than single institutions? And so we began to think about going to a collective group of actors that can operate together. Can we work with multiple institutions at the same time? Can we affect large parts of the research system? And of course, this will require many different types of inputs at the same time, and differences in the quality of the inputs as well. And of course, the first challenge is how? How are we going to do this? And it's in this thinking that I want to draw upon different areas and possibilities. How would you do research capacity strengthening with multiple institutions or systems? The first guidance comes to us from work that has been done for over 20 years in the field of management associated with this terminology of learning organizations, right? If you go back and look at the seminal work of Peter Senge and his books on the fifth discipline, both the fifth discipline and the art and practice of the learning organization, he talks about what it means to not just generate knowledge, but establish the practice of generating knowledge. Not just having processes, but going beyond their replication to actually thinking about them, understanding their motivations. And that's what learning organizations are about. And the evolution of this concept by Larson and Preskill into transforming organizations, or organizations that are continuously transforming themselves because they learn, they adapt. And that's important for us because we want to think about organizations beyond single centers, beyond single institutions there. This concept of learning organizations has been looked at in the healthcare field as well. The IOM released a report around it looking at learning healthcare systems and talked about the integration of research and practice. And of course, our very own colleagues Ruth Faden and Nancy Cass and others are looking at this from the perspective of learning healthcare organizations right here in the US, and stressing the need of going from research to learning, understanding that learning can occur in non-research processes as well. And the very important claim that they make, which is that in fact it's morally required for just healthcare systems to be learning organizations. And I'll come back to this point in a minute. And it's not just researchers, but everyone who's part of that system, whether it's patients or teachers, the researchers, the supporting staff, everyone is involved in this learning organizations. I feel as if this stream of work around learning organization is an opportunity for us, particularly in the context of low and middle income country settings. Why? I feel this is important because, in fact, the need for the utilization of research and evidence is even more stark and more important in the context of the developing world. And in fact, if this is morally required, as Faden and Cass and others are saying, then in fact, if you allow the integration of research and practice in less just contexts, maybe you are empowering mechanisms to make that context less unjust. Think about that possibility. How learning organizations may instill processes that can create systems which can make situations less unjust. And the moment I thought about this, I presented myself with another major challenge, which I want in the next few years to think through with my colleagues, which is, what if the context is extremely unjust? Why should we expect a healthcare system to be all about justice when the engineering system, the law system, the justice system itself is unjust? That's a tough one. Why should we hold a hospital, a set of hospitals, or a university system to be about justice when the legal system is not about justice? So important challenges, but I think a ray of hope and opportunity that this whole thinking, and I really hope that over the next few years I can work together with many of the colleagues here to think more about learning healthcare systems. The second approach that I think we can work with multiple institutions at the same time is well known to all of you. It is this notion of increasing the quantity of institutions you work with. But not just the quantity, but also the quality of those relationships. What types of partnerships do you develop with multiple institutions at the same time? What can you do together that each one cannot do alone? What is the multiplicative effect of working together across multiple institutions? And this, of course, is very well known in the development of consortia, right? And many of you may be participating in multi-institutional consortia. These are a set of complementary institutions who have some sort of vision, are working together. But the quality of those relationships, the goals with which these consortia pursue, and very importantly, the focus of these consortia can be all the way from narrow and extremely regimented to extremely loose and frankly ineffective. And so you have that spectrum, and you need to work within the spectrum and see how can we build further along this notion of multiple institutions. I want to share with you just two examples right here from the school in which I participate. Future Health Systems, a research consortium of 7 institutions across 5 developing countries, which work on multiple topics, all within the spectrum of improving healthcare delivery for the poor. And indeed, that consortium has provided learning around research to policy processes in many, many interesting ways. Similarly, a second consortium that focuses largely work on road safety, works across 10 countries, 6 fundamental consortium partners, and yet our component is working with 15 partners across 25 sites. Interesting learning opportunities and learning beyond the health sector. We have to engage with the engineering, with the transport, with the law sector. And yet, are we truly maximizing our learning opportunities in these consortia? In other words, I'm challenging ourselves to think very carefully about these consortia and figure out whether truly we are creating the type of learning organizations that we hope and that we claim in these particular efforts. Irrespective of whether you go the learning healthcare system or you go the consortia system, the challenge of measurement still remains. How do you measure these? And this is a challenge that now, of course, in the future will be very important to us the more we work with such consortia. And there are two options that I'm going to suggest to you today. Options that we haven't tested, but we might, and this is part of the future work that we would like to do. One is to go back to our framework and see, is there a way that we can keep applying this to the next level and the next level? And for those of you, obviously from the academic world, you understand if you have a square, you make a cube, and you pretend you've contributed to knowledge production. But there's a limit to how you can go from a cube to which other shape, right? I think there's a role to play of this framework. I'm not sure how it'll work out. So I thought carefully with some of my colleagues about the fact that when you look at consortia, you begin to recognize certain characteristics. You begin to see that there's diversity. You begin to recognize there are different variations of connectedness between institutions. You begin to recognize there is some interdependence, some more than others, and that the very notion of learning can be challenged. It's not just learning the content area, it's also learning about how to work with each other, learning how to trust each other, learning how you may not be the only institution receiving the primary funding, and it's okay for others to receive primary funding as well. And these are the characteristics that have defined something that my colleagues work on called complex systems. And so I want to invite my colleagues working on complex systems to use the model of complex adaptive systems to study these multi-institutional frameworks as well. And I think there are real possibilities in the science behind complex adaptive systems that we can use, because that are the types of complex models that are needed to understand this notion of research capacity strengthening. So they work with complexities like this. They work with complex adaptive systems and health systems. And I'm proposing that we can actually make one for the research system, and we can apply similar lenses for research consortia. Because in fact, these phenomena have the same characteristics that those natural and biological phenomena do. And I very much look forward to a dialogue with those experts in complex adaptive systems to see how we can use that to measure. So to summarize the multi-institutional level, this is an opportunity to address large parts of the system. You can have the opportunity to create large change. And of course, you don't have to do it at the same time. It can be phased, and different institutions can take responsibilities for different components. But there is a potential. There's a potential for large changes as opposed to incremental change. And of course, this doesn't mean there aren't risks. Of course, there are risks. It will require effort. It will require support. It will require management of not just technical issues, but political issues as well, and considerable ownership. So it will require a commitment at the level of ourselves as well. Are we truly ready to engage in this level of research capacity strengthening if we are going to change the landscape within which we operate? So today, I've tried to talk about why we want to engage in research capacity strengthening and the different levels at which we operate, the individual level, the institutional level, and indeed a system-wide level. I think I'd like to close by pointing out one critique and then tell you a couple of streams of work that I'd love to initiate. First of all, before anybody in the audience asks me the question, well, how do you know it were your efforts that made that change, right? The attribution question. And it's very important. And you should be asking this question, and there ought to be some studies that respond to it. What is responsible? But I think it may be a different question that is important for us. Because the right question might be, is any part of that change that you see attributable to the efforts that you've invested in? And this is akin to notions that we use in evaluation designs around plausibility design. Right? Any part of that change can be attributed back, as long as you're part of the story. Are you happy with it? Were you the most important part? Or were you the most catalytic part? Important questions. And fundamentally, for people like myself, even more important questions are, how can you do it? And how can you do it better? Learning from your experiences. This notion of continuous learning. And that's part of the push that I'm presenting today. So, to conclude, over the next few years, what I'd love to do, engage with my colleagues around the school to study research capacity strengthening within these multi-institutional models. What are the optimal models? What are the methods? How can we measure it? And we have opportunities, some of which I know about, and many, many, I'm sure, that I don't know about. And a second stream of work, which I think is increasingly important, that is the research capacity strengthening of partners that don't have knowledge generation as their primary goal, that have implementation. These are ministries. These are non-governmental organizations that are action-oriented. How can we involve them deeper and deeper in the business of research capacity strengthening? So, over the next few weeks and months, if you have a great idea around research capacity strengthening, drop me an email, send a line, and if the dean agrees, I would like to initiate an interest group focused around research capacity strengthening. Thank you very much for taking the time to come out and listen to me today.
So great talk, Adnan. So this picture was the same vehicle as in the first slide from a different angle, right?
Yeah.
So I have to say, it's hard to take good pictures from a moving vehicle and through windows. You did a great job with the pictures. And I think, I wonder what anybody else thinks about whether Adnan should go back to the handlebar mustache. Because I really like that as well. But, you know, it's just emblematic of your ability to deal with multiple concepts and with broad range of interest. The range of things you touched on in this talk was really great. So I'm sure people have comments and questions. So we'll go with Court here.
First of all, thank you. Always exciting and, as always, deeply thoughtful and integrative. Some of us who work in the arena of fragile states where we deal with internal, external conflict or catastrophe, it could be natural disaster, it could be just catastrophic governance. It seems to me that this idea of health research systems strengthening could be applied to that there are fragile health systems, research systems that are possibly within these fragile states, or maybe states that are seen as stronger but have these fragilities within the health systems research function and capacity. Could you talk about that? Is that an area? Because it would seem to me that in those places where there is probably more injustice of different kinds, that's where health research systems could in fact contribute to that broader sense of equity and transparency and ownership, connectedness.
Thank you, Court. And I knew my friends from the Center for Disaster Refugee Studies would be here. I have a 100-slide version of this presentation in which I have a couple of slides on, but I think you've identified two huge opportunities. One is in states of post-conflict, if you want to call it that, you also have the opportunity to make incremental change because you're working with less than nothing sometimes. And you have the mandate sometimes to create new institutions from the get-go. So I think on the one hand, you have a huge opportunity. The second thing is that you have also the chance and ability to measure baseline. You know, the hypothetical notion of what would have existed de novo is there. So I think applying some of these to context where you have situations where there's a lot of flux, a lot of instability, becomes extremely important. And that's why I think, in terms of measurement, the complex adaptive system approach will be very powerful in those contexts, as opposed to static measures of success that some of the other models, including the ones that we worked with, have worked with. But I'd love to explore that further with colleagues in CRDR and see how we can take this dialogue further.
So if I could just comment on your point about learning health, can you have a just health system in an unjust society? Well, certainly in public health, it seems our whole field is almost predicated on that because we work in so many countries where the rule of law doesn't prevail, right? And we believe that by discrete interventions or fixing part of a system, we can make it a better society. So I would say yes. Okay. So comments? No? Yeah. So Henry, could you grab that mic over there and just pass it back, please? Thank you. Thank you. We should have rubber mics that we could throw. That would make it a lot more fun. That's it.
Yeah. As long as they're rubber mics, yeah, that's it.
Okay, well, Thank you for the excellent presentation. And I just have a very short comment in terms of, the reasons that you give for capacity strengthening. I think they're excellent. Maybe let me be a bit daring and throw
Sure.
one there, and that would be local ownership. And for those colleagues that are here that work with USAID and other international donors, they probably have heard those words a lot lately. And that's something that has been very relevant, especially since the Declaration on Aid Effectiveness, the importance of local ownership, and of course in research, undoubtedly that plays an important role. And then in terms of a question, in terms of the Octagon Framework, you have some very interesting dimensions in there. And I didn't see leadership, and that's usually one of the dimensions that, and I'm sure it's included in one of them.
Yeah.
But I would like to know, which one, how did you include it in there? And also, in terms of those dimensions, I noticed that you mix some that are more tangible than others. And so I would like to know a little bit about how you came up with those.
Yeah. So great question. First, I agree with the comment about local ownership. I think you have to try and figure out whether the USAID principle is a strategic principle out of self-interest, or is it truly about future sustainability of that enterprise? And you see how those can play out. I think in terms of your question, absolutely, leadership is there. I didn't have the time to present the details of all of those 8 elements of the Octagon, but it's represented in more than one for the following reason. In one locus, when we talk about the basic identity, we are talking about institution-wide leadership. In another instance where we are talking about some of the processes within the organization, we are talking about leadership in specific areas. So for example, in research priority setting or in research ethics review, you can have different forms of leadership within the organization as well. So it's the concept of leadership is incorporated in many different elements. In terms of operationalizing this framework, you're absolutely right, which is why this tool is fundamentally a deliberative tool. Because at the end of the day, it's summarizing a sequence of subjective and objective parameters. It also depends upon who's doing it at what point in time. So it's not a tool that you would do in multiple institutions in, let's say, 2012 and say, this is how I rank my institutions. The fundamental premise is that institutions work with it to see their progress over time. So it's an iterative tool that allows institutions to track their own progress and say, yes, we are doing better in one area than the other, and relies heavily on institutions and the leadership participating in the process.
Down front here.
Thanks very much for the presentation. And at the beginning, you mentioned the idea of scholarship around research capacity building. And I'm wondering how much there is at this time, because I'm very interested in trying to do this as well. And how much do you focus on institutions? How much do you focus on individuals? How important is sustainable funding? And so how much do we know about this from research?
Yeah. I think, first of all, in terms of written material, you will find a lot of material, particularly in the donor world, about lessons learned, about experiential learning, lots of case studies. Some of the best case studies actually that I've read came out from 2 areas. One, the Council for Health Research and Development, CORED, and its work between the early 1990s to 2000, 2001, where they looked at about 8 or 9 of their case studies in research capacity strengthening. And the other, surprisingly, the work of Danida, the Danish development agency. They have an extensive program called Enrica. And in that program, they had 12 case studies at different levels. So yes, on the one hand, we have some very important experiential learning. And yet, if you look at the amount of truly what we would consider research-oriented work, empirical work, I think there's a dearth in the literature. And most of the published literature as well always draws upon more of a case study approach. And there's nothing wrong with that, but at the same time, the numbers are always small and few. So on the one hand, we have a lot of lessons learned. On the other hand, I don't think we have the blueprints that many people like to call for when they are thinking about investments in this area. In fact, donors increasingly are deciding to go one way or the other. So the Wellcome Trust, for example, firmly believes in the power of individuals. And they have now moved. Next month, I'm going to be on a panel for these £1 million grants. just to the single institution, to a single individual. That's what they firmly believe, and they want to empower those individuals. And Sida Sarek have moved completely now to working with institutions, for example. So I think it's a ripe area, and I would love to explore with you and look at other opportunities, how we can really do more scholarly work on this.
Any other questions or comments? If not, I'll thank you again, Adnan, and say what a great talk.
Thank you.